Hi, I'm Jared Gardner, and I'm going to try my best to explain the basics of molecular testing in only 10 minutes. Definitely, this is impossible, but I'm going to try anyway. So, how and why do I use molecular testing in my practice? Well, I'll tell you first up, I'm not a molecular pathologist, so maybe I'm not the most qualified person to give you this talk, but I do use molecular testing in my practice. I would say it accounts for a fraction of a percent of all the cases I see that I actually need to do molecular on, but when I do use it, it can be very helpful. So I'm not going to go into the real nitty-gritty details of the techniques, but more broad strokes about why and how I use molecular and how I select what test, so that you can understand better as a dermatologist why your derm path may be doing a certain test or not doing a certain test. So the first, probably most important thing, at least in my practice, is I'm doing it to decide between a difficult differential. I know that the tumor is probably either A or B, but I don't know which one, and I need molecular to tell me, because otherwise they can be very similar. So I use it, for me, it ends up being kind of most important in that context. There's other times where I'm almost certain I know what the tumor is, but it's a big difference from another tumor as far as treatment or prognosis goes. And so I do the molecular just to be as ironclad certain as possible that I'm not making a mistake. And then also we use it to obtain prognostic info or therapeutic eligibility info, like BRAF analysis on a melanoma, for example. And that's usually done upon request from oncologists, dermatologists, surgeons, people who are on the treating side. So the major molecular abnormalities, and obviously this is very simplified, remember there are point mutations where you get one nucleotide change in the DNA, in the gene, and it may make an alteration in the way the gene functions. Then we have larger structural abnormalities like deletions, where a big chunk of a chromosome and all the genes in it get deleted. Amplifications, where you have multiple extra copies of a given gene or group of genes. And then gene rearrangements or translocations or fusions, those words all mean essentially the same thing. That's when, for some reason, a gene breaks apart, it splits in the middle, another gene splits in the middle, and then one half of gene A fuses up with the other half of gene B. And I guess this is more or less what I just said. But basically, in point mutations, sometimes it doesn't result in any change in the gene, but we're not usually testing for mutations like that. What we are testing for usually is when a gene's either activated or inactivated, turned on or turned off by the result of the change in the nucleotide of the gene. Fusions or rearrangements are really important in my other specialty of sarcoma pathology, and as a lot of sarcomas and soft tissue tumors arise in the skin, that's important. It's also an emerging area of great importance in, I guess maybe not emerging anymore, but well-established area of importance in melanocytic lesions, particularly spitzoid and Spitz melanocytic lesions, which there's a growing list of different fusions that are involved in Spitz nevi and other spitzoid melanocytic lesions. And so in this, like I said, the two genes break apart and then one half fuses with the other, and what you get is a new, totally novel gene, what we call a chimeric gene, that when it's transcribed, it creates a new protein that's kind of a hybrid of one half of what the protein would have been originally and one half of the other protein. And so sometimes that can create the impetus for a tumor to develop or grow because of this new chimeric gene and its gene product protein that affects the function of the cell. Deletions and amplifications, like I said, it's either when a big chunk of the DNA is missing or when you get extra copies of that. So deletions, an example of that would be like in spindle cell lipomas, we often have deletions of the long arm of chromosome 13 where the retinoblastoma gene resides. And so that gene gets knocked out, and what you have is only one copy of RB1 left in the tumor cells rather than two copies. And that plays a role in the growth of that benign tumor. In that case, it's benign. Amplifications, not really, I can't think of a lot of examples of where that's important in derm path, but in soft tissue pathology, well-differentiated liposarcomas, which are really, really rare in the skin, they have amplifications of a gene called MDM2 and some other genes around it. I guess at one time that would be important is in breast cancer. When breast cancer metastasizes to the skin, we usually will still do HER2/neu and ER/PR testing because the oncologists want to know what the status is for treatment. Even if the patient already had ER/PR and HER2 tested on their original primary breast cancer, usually once a tumor metastasizes, we want to test again to see if the status has changed. And so we usually use immunohistochemistry to test for that. But depending on what the immunohistochemical results show for HER2, it sometimes reflexes on to do a FISH to detect if there's a true amplification of the HER2 gene or not. And so what you get is multiple additional copies of that gene of interest in a given cell if there's an amplification. So a very super basic summary of the molecular testing methods that can be used. Again, ultra basic. PCR, as you all know, is polymerase chain reaction. It takes DNA and makes lots of extra copies of it, so we can take a small number of tumor cells and make enough DNA copies to perform an additional analysis on. And FISH is where we use a probe with a fluorescent probe with a DNA that it's attached to, and the DNA fuses the DNA in cells, and we look for the little dots under a fluorescent microscope to see what's happened. RT-PCR is another method of a special form of PCR. CGH is comparative genomic hybridization. And then there's sequencing, where we look for the individual nucleotide sequence. And then next gen sequencing, or NGS, or massive parallel sequencing, there's different names for it, is when we're testing a bunch of different genes all at the same time. It's like sequencing times like 100 or times 1,000. It's like next gen, right? That's why they call it that. So there, again, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself explaining on the summary slides, but that's what I just told you. I think the important point here is that to remember that these tests detect different things. So FISH can detect structural changes, relatively large changes on the genomic level, fusions where genes break apart and refuse together, amplifications or deletions, but it cannot detect things like a BRAF mutation, right? That's a single tiny nucleotide, not big enough to alter where the FISH probes would bind. So you have to know when you're selecting these tests, not just the gene that you're testing for, but the method that you're using. Is it going to detect the type of abnormality that you have, whether it's a fusion, deletion, a mutation, an amplification, etc. RT-PCR is it detects mRNA and then turns it back into a cDNA copy to see if a given transcript of mRNA is present. You can use that for viral testing, like in the case of COVID. It can also be used as an alternative way to look for fusions instead of FISH. But you have to know what exact two partner genes you're looking for, because you have to have primers on both sides of those to be able to reproduce the whole mRNA transcript. CGH is used for looking at kind of in broad strokes across the whole genome, all of the chromosomes, to see if there are areas of gains or losses of chromosome. So that can kind of help to tell if there is amplifications or deletions, etc. Things that are large gains or losses of copy number, okay? Again, it's not going to my knowledge, be able to detect individual little point mutations. Sequencing, though, is what we're going to use, or some variation of that, when we're looking for a point mutation, a one nucleotide change from the normal gene to the altered, mutated gene. So we would amplify the DNA, and then we would sequence it to see if it's normal or if it's got an abnormal nucleotide in it. And then NGS, like I said, is very complicated. It can test for lots and lots of the things we just discussed all at the same time. So why don't we do that on everything? Well, I think some people, that's the goal and dream, is to be able to just run NGS on everything. But there's a few caveats to that. Number one is not every lab has access to this easily. Number two, I'm not an expert on the billing aspects, but my understanding is this is still relatively more expensive than many or most of the other molecular tests. Again, this video is being made in spring of 2022. Things change very rapidly in this space, so it may be that some years down the road that's different. And then also, it depends, each different NGS panel, the list of what genes and what types of abnormalities are detected varies from panel to panel. So you have to make sure that the panel you're using actually will detect the types of gene abnormalities that you're looking for the given case that you're looking at. So that's when it's important to kind of read the fine print. It's also important to talk to a molecular pathologist if you're not sure. They can be very useful in helping select the proper test for the given situation. So here's an example of FISH looking for amplification in this case. So we use two probes, the green probes and the red probes. Green are actually binding the centromere, kind of as a control, the centromere of the chromosome, to show us that there's two copies of the chromosome, which is normal. But red, in a normal cell, there should be two greens and two reds. Red is the gene of interest. I think in this case, this was actually MDM2 gene amplification in a well-diff liposarcoma, actually. What we see is instead of 2 copies, each cell has many additional copies of red. So it's not multiple extra copies of the whole gene, just extra copies of of the whole chromosome. It's not extra copies. It's just extra copies of that gene and some of the surrounding genes. Whereas you only have 2 of the chromosomes, you have multiple extra copies of the gene of interest. So that's amplification. HER2 would look like this too if it was amplified. And there's another view. Again, 2 green dots. And normally we should have 2 red dots, but instead we've got 25 or something. Now, you can also use FISH to detect rearrangements or fusions, like I said, and what we do is then use break-apart probes. And so this is a little different, the same kind of concept as the last slide, where you're using a fluorescently labeled DNA probe for a region of interest in the DNA. But here what we're doing is we're getting 2 probes that are really close together, one on each side of the given gene that we think might be broken apart. And when the red and the green dots are really close, guess what they do? They make a yellow dot. They look red, green, and yellow. So normal cell would have a yellow, red, green, yellow little dot and another red, green, yellow dot. 2 of those little those little clumped together areas would be a normal cell. But in an abnormal cell where 1 copy of the gene that we're looking at is broken apart and then fused with another partner gene, what will happen is that the gene breaking apart goes elsewhere in the chromosome, and so those red and green signals are split apart or broken apart, thus the name, from each other. And what we see is the yellow dot, normal, and then the other copy is a red and green separate, and that means the gene is broken apart. Sometimes you need to detect what the partner is, and in that case, you'll need to use a different FISH probe for the other partner of interest, or use RT-PCR, depending. Sometimes we don't need to know. I know if this gene is broken apart, that's enough to solve the case. Other times I know, like in the Ewing's gene, for example, which can be broken apart in many, many different tumors, knowing it's broken apart is not enough. I need to know additional information, like the partner gene, for example. It depends on the situation. So here's a DFSP, a classic example. I personally would not do molecular on a case like this. It's basically diagnostic on H&E in the right clinical context. Maybe I'd use 1 or 2 stains like CD34 and S100 to make sure it's not a neurofibroma or something. But this looks classic. But what if you have, and if you did molecular, it'd look like this. And this would be usually the PDGFB, collagen 1A1 PDGFB fusion is what we see in DFSP. There's also an alternate fusion of the PDGFD, D as in Delta, gene, which we've recently has been discovered in recent years. So what you see is the 1 yellow copy, normal. The other copy of the gene, the collagen 1A1 or the PDGFB, whichever this was for, would be broken apart. So that would confirm the diagnosis if we needed it. So a case where we might use molecular would be like this. This is that storiform world swirled pattern, but I can't see, if I just had a sample, like a little punch out of the middle of the tumor, I can't see, the fat, if there's honeycomb fat entrapment. I can't see how the tumor interacts with the epidermis or the peripheral dermis. And those are clues that are helpful to me sometimes in a hard case in deciding if it's DF or DFSP. Most of the time it's easy, even on H&E, with some experience, to tell dermatofibroma apart from DFSP. But in some cases, occasionally, I have trouble, and then immunostains usually can solve that. But there's even sometimes those on a small sample, particularly, where even with immunostains, I'm still not totally sure. When I use this the most is when I'm pretty sure something's not DFSP, but I'm not 100% sure. So I'm either going to say benign, leave it alone, or this is a tumor that needs a big, Mohs or wide local excision. So big difference. So to be totally sure, I'd send for FISH in cases like that, just to make totally sure it's not DFSP. And in this case, it's not DFSP. This is a dermatofibroma, actually, which can sometimes become very storiform in appearance and mimic DFSP. And if we did FISH here, it would be negative for the DFSP collagen 1A1 PDGFB fusion. Here's a different type of scenario. So this is a metastatic melanoma that actually was metastatic to the orbit near the eye and was causing significant problems for the person because it was, impinging on the globe of the eye. And so in this case, BRAF mutation analysis was ordered by the oncologist, and it was positive for BRAF V600E mutation. And so because of that, BRAF inhibitor therapy was initiated, and that in this case led to at least a temporary complete response and resolution of symptoms for a large part for this patient. So that's the kind of time where we already knew this was melanoma, but doing this test allowed the oncologist to select the appropriate therapy. So I've already gone several minutes over 10, but hopefully this has given you at least some of the flavor of the way we use molecular testing and the types of abnormalities we can test for and the types of tests we can use. And remember, there are people who do entire fellowships and spend their entire career in pathology just on the topic of molecular pathology. So it's so far over my head still, and definitely it's farther than I can go over in 10 minutes. So I hope this helped a little bit, and have a great day. Oh, wait, I forgot. There's actually a little image here. This is an example of what sequencing looks like. This is not BRAF gene, but it's the same concept where you can see the wild type here. Each color represents one nucleotide, and this would be the wild type normal. And here there's a green for A, and up here it's been replaced, and what you get is one copy has the A, and the other mutated has an alternate abnormality, right? And so you can see that this exact nucleotide is the one that has been mutated. And so this is the kind of sequencing and what it looks like on the molecular pathologist side. All right, now I think that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thanks for watching.